6, the eggs are still cooking when he says it. I am standing at the stove, early light coming through the window above the sink, and the kitchen smells the way it always does. Cast iron, butter, wood smoke from last night's fire that hasn't fully left the walls. Eli is sitting at the table behind me. I can hear his fork against the plate. Then he stops, and he says, very quietly, that the deacon will be coming by this afternoon. He says it the way you might say the farrier is coming, or the rain will hold off until evening. My hands keep moving. The spatula turns the eggs, but something inside me folds shut like a hymnal. Nobody is reading anymore. I don't turn around. I already know what it means. But I need to go back first, because the first time I said no to my husband, he didn't say a single word. My name is Sarah, and this is where I share the things I carried in silence for most of my life. If these stories help you understand something about the Amish, about women, about the weight of being quiet, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and stayed. Tell me in the comments, have you ever said no to something everyone around you accepted as normal? I'd like to hear your answer now. Let me take you back to where this began. I met Eli at a singing the autumn I turned 17. For those who don't know, singings are what Amish young people attend on Sunday evenings. They're held in the same home where church met that morning, the benches rearranged, lanterns lit along the table, and the hymns shift from the slow ones of worship to the faster ones we were allowed to enjoy. Eli sat across from me that first night. He didn't speak to me during the singing. He waited until afterward, outside by the buggies, when the dark had settled thick over the yard, and the only light came from the kitchen window behind us. He asked if he could drive me home. His voice was low and unhurried. I said yes. I remember the sound of his horse's hooves on the gravel, the cold air on my face, the feeling that something steady had just begun. We courted the way our community expected, slowly, carefully, with very little said aloud about what we felt. In our district, courtship was not about passion. It was about discernment. You were choosing someone to build a life with inside the ordnung, the unwritten rules that shaped everything from the width of your hat brim to the prayers you said before sleep. I believed in the ordnung the way I believed in the floor beneath my feet. I didn't question it. It held me up. And when Eli asked me to marry him on a Tuesday evening in my parents' kitchen, with my father already knowing because Eli had spoken with the deacon first, I said yes with my whole heart. I believed that Gelassenheit, the yielding of self, was not a loss. It was a gift. I was giving myself to God's design. That is what I was taught, and I believed it. We were married in November, as most Amish weddings happen after the fall harvest. The house was full. The benches were packed. The bishop spoke for nearly 3 hours. I wore a new blue dress my mother and I had sewn together, and a white cape and apron, and my hands were folded in my lap the entire service, because I didn't know what else to do with the trembling. We moved into the small house on Eli's family's property, 2 rooms downstairs, 2 upstairs, a kitchen that caught the morning light, and a porch that faced the fields. I thought I understood what marriage would be. I understood the work of it, the garden, the canning, the laundry on the line, the meals made 3 times a day without exception. What I did not understand, what no one had prepared me for, was the private part. The closeness that happened after the lamp was turned down and the door was closed. In my community, no one spoke about what happened between a husband and wife at night. Not my mother, not my sisters, not the older women who taught me to make bread and mend fences and birth calves. There was no conversation, no preparation, no language given to me for what my body would be asked to do and to feel. What I learned in the dark, in silence, from Eli's hands, and from the understanding, never spoken but absolute, that this was part of the covenant. A wife's body belonged to the marriage, the way the land belonged to the family. It was not discussed because it did not need to be discussed. It simply was, and I accepted that. For years, I accepted that fully, not because I was forced, because I did not have the word for what was missing. I did not know I was allowed to want something different. The absence of language is its own kind of cage, and I lived inside it without knowing the bars were there. The children came quickly. Our first son arrived 10 months after the wedding, then a daughter, then another son. By the time I was 24, I had 3 children under 5 1/4 on the way. Eli worked hard. I will say that plainly because it is true, and because this story is not about making him the villain. He built furniture in the shop behind the house. He led family devotions each evening. He was patient with the children in the way that quiet men often are. Not warm exactly, but steady, present. He did not raise his voice. He did not drink. He did not disappear on weekends the way some husbands in nearby English towns did. By every measure our community used, he was a good husband, and by every measure our community used, I was a good wife. The trouble is, those measures didn't reach the places where I was starting to disappear. The 4th baby came hard. 31 hours of labor, a midwife who prayed more than she instructed, and a tear that took weeks to heal. The pain was constant, not sharp, but deep, the kind that lives in your bones and makes you hold your breath each time you sit down or stand up or lift the baby to your chest. I was bleeding for longer than I should have been. I was not sleeping. I was nursing through cracked skin and clenched teeth. And 3 weeks after that birth, on a night when the house was finally quiet and the lamp had been turned low, Eli reached for me, not roughly, not with anger, the way he always had, as if this was the next thing that happened at the end of a day, the way evening follows afternoon. And for the first time in my marriage, I said no. I said it quietly, almost a whisper. I said I was in pain. I said I couldn't. I said not yet. He lay still for a long moment. Then he turned over. He didn't speak. In the morning, he was already in the barn before I came downstairs. We never mentioned it. Not that day, not that week, not ever. The first refusal passed between us like weather. A single cold night in an otherwise steady season. In the weeks after, I waited for something to change, for Eli to become cold or angry, or to bring it up during evening prayer, the way some husbands brought their grievances before God in a tone their wives were meant to overhear. But none of that happened. Life continued. The baby grew, my body healed slowly, and I began to feel something I had not expected. A quiet, careful hope. Maybe he understood. Maybe he had seen my pain and chosen to respect it. Maybe somewhere inside the structure of this marriage, there was a small room where my voice mattered. I held on to that hope the way you hold a candle in wind, not trusting it fully, but not willing to let it go. I didn't know yet that this hope would become the most dangerous thing I carried, because it was this hope, this belief that I had a right to say no, that made me say it again. There was a woman named Martha who I knew from quilting frolics in a neighboring district. She was older than me by about 8 years, a quiet woman with careful hands and a way of laughing that stopped just short of her eyes. We were not close friends, not in the way English women might be, but we sat beside each other often enough that a kind of trust grew between us, the way ivy grows along a wall, slowly, without anyone deciding it should. One afternoon, while the other women were in the kitchen, Martha said something to me that I have never forgotten. She started to say something about her own marriage, about a night, about what she had done, about what happened after. And then another woman walked into the room, and Martha stopped, mid-sentence. She picked up her needle and didn't look at me again for the rest of the afternoon. I didn't ask her to finish. In our world, you didn't press. But I carried that half-sentence with me for months, turning it over in my mind the way you turn a stone in your pocket. I didn't know yet that Martha's unfinished story and mine were stitched from the same cloth, huh? What I noticed in the months after that first night was not a single moment, but a slow shifting. Eli was not cruel. He was not distant in any way I could point to and say that is where it changed. But something had thinned between us. He no longer reached for my hand during evening prayer. He spoke to me in shorter sentences. He answered questions I hadn't asked about the shop, about the weather, about the children's schedules, as though filling the air between us with facts would keep something else from being heard. I think now that my first refusal lived inside him not as something he accepted, but as something he absorbed the way wood absorbs water, silently, invisibly, until one day the frame begins to warp. He never brought it up. He never accused me, but I could feel it in the space between us at meals, in the way he turned away a half-second sooner at night, in the careful blankness of his face when I spoke. The first refusal was not accepted. I understand that now. It was stored. 7 months passed between the first refusal and the second. 7 months of ordinary life, canning season, church Sundays every other week, the children growing the way children do, without asking permission. 7 months in which I convinced myself that the silence between Eli and me was healing, when really it was hardening. The second night came in early spring. The windows were cracked open for the first time since autumn, and I could hear the peepers in the pond behind the barn, that high, urgent sound they make when the world is thawing. Eli reached for me, and this time I was not in pain. I was not bleeding. I was not recovering from anything the body could name. I simply did not want to, and for the first time in my life, I recognized that as a reason, not an excuse, not a failing, a reason I said no, quietly, the same as before, but differently, because this time the no came from somewhere deeper than my body, came from the part of me that had been slowly waking up for 7 months without my permission. Eli did not turn over this time. He sat up in the dark. I could feel the mattress shift beneath his weight. He was quiet for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only seconds. Then he said 4 words I will carry for the rest of my life. He said, "This is the second time," not loud, not angry, almost factual, the way you might note that it rained twice this week. And then he got up and left the room. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, the back door opening and closing, and then nothing. I lay in the dark and listened to the peepers and understood, in a way that arrived like nausea, slow, then all at once, that the first refusal had not been forgiven. It had been filed. Eli had been waiting, not for me to say no again exactly, but for confirmation that the first time was not an accident, and I had just given him that confirmation. 1 refusal was a stumble. 2 was a direction, and in our community, direction mattered more than almost anything. The morning from the hook, the eggs, the kitchen, the deacon's name dropped into the air like a stone into still water. That was the next day. I remember the light. I remember the smell of the butter browning. I remember that my youngest was in the high chair behind me, banging a wooden spoon against the tray, and the sound felt like it was coming from very far away. When the deacon arrived that afternoon, I was not invited into the room. Eli and the deacon sat in the front room, the good room, the one we used for church when it was our turn to host, and I stood in the kitchen with the door closed between us, my hands in dishwater that had gone cold. I could hear their voices through the wall, low, measured, the steady rhythm of Pennsylvania Dutch that I had known my whole life, the language of my lullabies and my prayers, now carrying words about me that I was not allowed to hear. I stood there for nearly 40 minutes. When the deacon left, Eli came into the kitchen and told me I would need to speak with the bishop. He said it gently, the way you tell someone that a storm is coming and there is nothing to be done but prepare. Before the bishop meeting, I went to see Martha. I told her what had happened, the refusal, the deacon, what was coming, and Martha, who had stopped her own story mid-sentence months ago at the quilting frolic, finally finished it. She told me that 3 years before, she had refused her husband once, just once. Her husband had gone to the bishop the following week. Martha was called to confess before the congregation. She described it to me carefully, the way you describe a wound to someone who is about to receive the same one. She told me about kneeling on the wooden floor in front of the benches. She told me about the faces of women she had known her entire life, women who had held her babies, who had brought casseroles when her mother died, who had sat beside her at singings when they were girls. She told me the bishop asked if she was willing to yield, to submit, to return to the order of her marriage as God intended. And Martha told me she said yes. She said yes in front of everyone. Then Martha looked at me, and her eyes were dry, but her voice was not. And she said the thing that broke something open inside my chest. She said, "I said yes, and I meant it. And I have never forgiven myself for meaning it. I didn't speak. I couldn't." Martha's story was not a warning. It was a mirror, held up so close I could see my own reflection in the glass. The buggy ride to the bishop's house took 20 minutes. I remember every one of them. The road was mud and gravel, and the horse moved slowly, and I could feel each bump and rut through the wooden seat. The fields on either side were just beginning to green. that pale, uncertain color that spring wears before it commits to anything. My hands were folded in my lap, the way they had been folded on my wedding day, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the same postures could mean such different things. Then it meant devotion. Now it meant there was nothing left to hold. The sky was gray and low, the air smelled like wet earth and the faint sweetness of manure from the dairy farm we passed. I did not pray during that ride. I tried, but the words wouldn't come, not because I had lost my faith, but because I didn't know who I would be praying to become. The bishop was a man of 73. His name was Levi, and he had led our district for over 20 years. He was not a harsh man. I want to be clear about that, because this story could easily become one about cruel men, and that is not the story I am telling. Levi believed deeply, genuinely, completely in the order he was charged with protecting. He welcomed me into his kitchen. His wife brought coffee and then left the room. He sat across from me and spoke gently, the way a father speaks to a child he loves but does not understand. He told me that Eli had come to him not from anger but from concern for our marriage, for my spiritual well-being, for the health of our family. He opened his Bible and read from Ephesians. He used the word Gelassenheit, yielding, surrender, the letting go of self. And when he said it, I could hear in his voice that this word was sacred to him. He explained that a wife's resistance, when it becomes a pattern, is understood as resistance not merely to her husband, but to the order God has established. He asked if I was willing to confess before the church and to recommit myself to the covenant of my marriage. I sat in his kitchen and looked at my hands and said yes, not because I agreed, because I could not see any other door in the room. The confession happened on a Sunday. I will tell it to you in the present, because that is how it still lives inside me. The benches are full. The room is warm, too warm, with the heat of 60 bodies pressed close together, and the air smells like wood smoke and wool and the faint sharpness of lye soap. The hymn from the Ausbund has just ended. The last note still hanging in the air, the way smoke hangs after you blow out a candle. The bishop stands. He speaks my name. I rise from my bench. My legs carry me to the front of the room, the way legs carry you in a dream, moving, but not quite yours. I kneel on the wooden floor. It is hard beneath my knees. I can feel the grain of the wood through my stockings. The bishop asks me if I have strayed from the order of my marriage. I say yes. He asks if I am willing to yield. I say yes. He asks if I submit myself to the authority of the church and to God's design for my life as a wife. I say yes. My voice is steady. My hands are trembling against my apron, and I press them flat so no one will see. I look up once. The women on the left side, my side, are watching. Some look at the floor. Some look directly at me. Rachel, who taught me to make strawberry preserves. Anna, who held my hand during my first labor. I cannot tell if they are judging me or grieving with me. The bishop places me under a 6-week probation. I return to my bench. Across the room, on the men's side, Eli sits with his hands on his knees. He does not look at me, not once. The 6 weeks passed. They passed the way all hard seasons pass, one morning at a time, one meal at a time, one set of small hands reaching for me that I could still hold because the children didn't know. The children never knew. That was the part that amazed me, how completely the surface of our life remained undisturbed while something underneath had cracked all the way through. Eli was gentler during those weeks and after, not because he understood what I had felt, because the system had done its work. The disruption had been named, confessed, and resolved. Order was restored. He could return to the version of our marriage that made sense to him, and he did with something that looked like relief. I did not refuse again. I want to be honest about that. I did not refuse again, not because I had been convinced and not because I had surrendered, but because I had seen the cost. The cost was not the kneeling. The cost was not the 6 weeks. The cost was Martha's face when she said she meant it. The cost was learning that the system does not punish you for falling. It punishes you for standing up on purpose. It took me years to understand what had really happened. The system did not discipline me for saying no. It disciplined me for saying no twice. The first refusal could be understood. A body in pain, a wife recovering, a moment of physical limitation. That refusal fit inside the structure because it could be framed as weakness, and weakness is forgivable. The second refusal could not be framed that way. The second refusal was will. It was choice. It was a woman deciding that her own wanting, or her own not wanting, was reason enough. And in a community built on Gelassenheit, on the yielding of individual will to the collective order, my will was the most dangerous thing I carried. Both things are true, and I need you to hear that. I loved my community. I loved the singing. I loved the way the women gathered, the way the seasons shaped our days, the way belonging felt like a quilt wrapped around your shoulders on a January morning. And that belonging had a price that was set for me before I was born, written into a covenant I signed before I understood what I was giving away. I do not hate the Amish. I do not hate Eli. I grieve for what was asked of us, of both of us, by a system that taught us love and silence in the same breath. If you have ever been in a room full of people who love you and felt more alone than you have ever felt in your life, then you already understand what I cannot quite put into words. I am not telling you this story to be pitied. I am telling it because silence was the first thing they taught me, and it is the last thing I am willing to carry. There is a girl somewhere right now, in a house with no electricity, folding her hands in her lap because she does not know they were made for anything other than folding. I was her. Maybe you were too. Maybe you weren't, but you know her. I am standing outside now, in a life I chose, and the wind is on my face, and I can hear how far the sky goes. And the truest thing I know is this: a woman's no does not become a sin just because she means it.